The courtroom was colder than usual that morning, not because of the temperature, but because of the tone. Spectators filled the gallery, some seasoned journalists scribbling in notepads, others political observers whispering predictions under their breath. But everyone had come for the same reason: to witness what many called the most unusual judicial hearing in recent memory. At the center of it all sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, calm and poised. But beneath that composure was a fire she had learned to control, sharpen, and unleash only when necessary. The judge presiding over the hearing was not just any judge. It was Judge Ronald Treymore, a man known as much for his arrogance as for his lengthy tenure on the bench. Appointed during a political era that valued brashness over balance, Treymore had become something of a relic, a symbol of authority unchecked, and a system that had gone too long without accountability. Why had Jasmine Crockett been called? To testify? What was it about her presence that seemed to agitate the judge from the very start? Was this truly about the legal matter at hand, or was something deeper, more insidious, unfolding beneath the surface? Jasmine was not on trial. Not officially. She had been called as a key witness in an ethics hearing tied to a high-profile political scandal involving campaign misuse of federal grants. She had spoken publicly about the misuse months earlier, her voice unfiltered, unapologetic, and her words had hit nerves in high places. Now those in power seemed desperate to push back. Judge Treymore leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, eyes narrowing on her like a hawk circling its prey. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said with deliberate pause, "you've made quite a name for yourself by, shall we say, speaking out of turn in recent weeks." Murmurs stirred in the crowd. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady but unreadable. She knew the tactic. It wasn't a question. It was bait. She refused to bite. "I speak when people are afraid to listen," she replied coolly. "And I don't recall your courtroom being exempt from truth." The judge smirked. "This isn't a town hall, Miss Crockett. And you are not on Capitol Hill now. You are in my court, under my rules." The undertone wasn't just condescending. It was venomous. There was something personal in his voice, something that went beyond judicial procedure. Was this about power? Ego? Or was it the judge's discomfort with the kind of woman Jasmine had become? Unapologetic, educated, unshaken by intimidation. "You're right," Jasmine replied, her tone unshaken. "This isn't Capitol Hill, which means political grandstanding has no place here." There was a brief silence. Not a single pen moved. Even the stenographer seemed to hesitate. The air was electric, tense, expectant. Then the judge laughed, not a laugh of humor but mockery. "You think you're smarter than the court? That you can walk in here and play the hero? Smarter?" Jasmine leaned forward now. "No, but I do believe I'm less corrupt." Gasps echoed through the room like a ripple through still water. The statement hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. The judge banged his gavel. "You will refrain from slandering this court. And you," she said, voice rising just slightly, "will refrain from pretending this courtroom is your personal playground." The tension had reached a boiling point. But why had the judge allowed this to escalate? Why did it seem like he was not only targeting Jasmine but exposing himself in the process? Was he trying to intimidate her into silence, or had he grown careless in the presence of someone who refused to shrink? Outside the building, a quiet storm had already begun to brew. An anonymous tip, circulating through legal circles for weeks, had landed in the inbox of an investigative journalist early that morning. It alleged misconduct by none other than Judge Treymore himself. Now word was quietly spreading. Phones buzzed in pockets. Whispers turned to questions. Had the judge overplayed his hand? Was this courtroom showdown about to turn into something much bigger than a political squabble? Inside the room, Jasmine Crockett sat back in her chair, eyes never leaving the man, behind the bench. She had seen this playbook before. Arrogance, masking fear, authority disguising vulnerability. But what she didn't know yet, what no one knew, was that justice wasn't just watching that day. It was walking down the hallway, toward the courtroom door. As Judge Treymore adjusted his robe and shuffled papers that no longer held the courtroom's attention, the undercurrent of tension had transformed into something deeper: suspicion. It wasn't just the spectators or the press who sensed it. Even the attorneys seated nearby, once disinterested in what they assumed would be routine testimony, now sat forward, eyes fixed on the judge. The shift was palpable. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her last words still echoed in the chamber, a challenge wrapped in restraint. She had done something few witnesses dared. She confronted not only the authority of the bench, but the integrity of the man behind it. And she had done so with precision, never once raising her voice. But what made Judge Treymore snap? Why did her words, calmly spoken, rattle him so deeply? The judge's next move betrayed more than emotion. "Court will recess for 10 minutes, he announced abruptly, standing up and exiting without eye contact. It was uncharacteristic. Judges rarely left in the middle of testimony without reason. Something was off. As the bailiff escorted people out and murmurs began to swell, Jasmine remained seated, folding her hands in her lap. She turned slightly toward the gallery and caught the eye of a man she hadn't noticed before. Sharply dressed, phone in hand, expression unreadable. Investigative journalist, she guessed. He gave the smallest nod, then slipped out the side door. Back in his chambers, Judge Treymore closed the heavy oak door and exhaled sharply. He opened a drawer, pulled out a bottle of antacids, and tossed 2 into his mouth. His hands trembled slightly. He reached for his phone, unlocked it, and began scrolling through messages. Dozens of them, some marked urgent. And there it was, a single text that read, "The affidavit is public." His grip tightened around the phone. Outside, the tension had metastasized into action. A pair of plainclothes officers entered through the main doors and quietly made their way to the clerk's desk. They didn't speak to anyone, not yet, but their presence was unmistakable. Jasmine noticed them. So did the court reporter. But no one dared ask why they were there. The attorneys whispered amongst themselves. One leaned over to Jasmine and muttered, "Do you know what this is about?" She turned to him with the trace of a smile. "I think we're about to find out." Within minutes, Judge Treymore re-entered the courtroom. But something in him had changed. The swagger was gone, the smirk absent. His robe dragged slightly behind him, unbuttoned at the collar. And though he attempted to gather himself, the room could feel it. He no longer held control. He sat down, cleared his throat, and without looking at Jasmine said, "The court will resume." Before Jasmine could speak, the door creaked open. The 2 plainclothes officers walked in slowly but with purpose. They approached the bench, deliberately, silently, until they stood at either side of the judge. Whispers broke into quiet gasps. "Judge Ronald Treymore," one officer said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "by order of the Federal District Court, you are hereby placed under arrest for obstruction of justice and judicial misconduct." Silence collapsed into chaos. Spectators rose to their feet. Journalists scrambled for their cameras. Attorneys looked at one another in disbelief. The judge's face went pale. "This is a mistake," he muttered. "This is political. This is manufactured." The officer didn't flinch. "You have the right to remain silent." But Judge Treymore wasn't silent anymore. "You don't know who I am," he barked, rising from his seat as if that fact alone could repel the law. "This is my courtroom." "Not anymore," Jasmine said, standing slowly. Their eyes met for one final time. There was no gloating in her voice, no malice in her face, only clarity. "You spent years making people feel small in this room," she continued, calm as ever. "Today, you remembered that justice does not serve the man in the robe. It serves the people before him. The courtroom erupted, not with applause, but with reverent awe. Cameras clicked. Reporters whispered headlines into their microphones. And as the judge was led out in cuffs, Jasmine turned toward the gallery once more. She did not smile. There was too much history, too much pain to celebrate. But justice had arrived, and it had walked straight through the front door. The moment Judge Treymore was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs sent a shudder across the nation. Within minutes, clips of the arrest flooded every social media platform, with hashtags erupting in every direction. Cable news anchors broke from scheduled programming. The internet wasn't just reacting, it was exploding. But inside that courtroom, as the echo of the judge's final outburst faded, a new kind of silence settled in. It was not the silence of fear or confusion, but of reckoning. Jasmine Crockett remained still. Her hands rested gently on the railing before her, her expression stoic but alert. Reporters continued scribbling, murmurs swirled, but Jasmine kept, her eyes fixed ahead. She knew this moment wasn't just about a fallen judge. It was about the system that let him rise unchecked for so long. Was this the beginning of a larger unraveling? Had Treymore been the only one pulling strings behind the curtain, or was he simply the most visible piece of something deeper, more coordinated? The acting presiding officer, a quiet, younger magistrate named Lydia Kent, stepped in to stabilize the hearing. She did so with calm authority, restoring order without theatrics. She looked at Jasmine, nodded once, then addressed the court. "The hearing will proceed, but let it be known," Judge Kent said firmly. "Today will be remembered not for its disruption, but for its integrity." Jasmine returned the nod. She walked back to the witness stand, no longer under a shadow of intimidation. What had started as a hostile grilling had transformed into a public awakening. The prosecutors resumed their questions. This time, however, the tone was different. Less combative, more respectful. Jasmine answered with clarity, backing her claims with evidence, citing specific reports and legislation. The chamber shifted from spectacle to education, as if those watching realized for the first time just how much she had prepared, and how little Treymore had expected it. Outside, the courthouse steps were now swarmed. Protesters and supporters mixed into a sea of voices. Some carried signs supporting Crockett. Others shouted in disbelief at the judge's arrest. But even in chaos, one truth rang clear. The system had shown a crack, and a powerful woman had stood firm in the face of it. Later that evening, a special news segment aired across multiple networks. It began with footage from earlier in the day, the moment Judge Treymore was cuffed, the stunned faces in the gallery, and Jasmine's unflinching stare. Then came the background. Treymore, it turned out, had a pattern: sealed complaints, buried, allegations, and quiet settlements paid out over years. No one had dared speak up. Those who tried had been quietly pushed out of courtrooms, demoted, or labeled problematic. Until now. Investigators credited an anonymous tip for finally opening the floodgates. But behind that tip was something more dangerous to the old guard: public attention, amplified by a figure like Jasmine Crockett. In a late-night panel, political analysts began to argue. One called it the Crockett Doctrine, referring to a new era of elected officials refusing to be silenced by institutions once thought untouchable. Others warned it might just be a one-off, a lucky break against a rogue judge. But those closer to the Capitol knew better. Jasmine's composure, her refusal to back down, and her flawless understanding of the law had changed something. She had not simply survived the judge's wrath, she had turned his courtroom into a mirror and forced the nation to look at itself. The next morning, Congresswoman Crockett released a short public statement. She didn't mention the judge by name. She didn't revel in his arrest. Instead, she wrote, "Accountability must not be an act of revenge, but a function of justice. Yesterday was not about winning. It was about proving that silence is no longer our only option. The post was shared over 1 million times, but even as she tried to move forward, questions remained. Who protected Treymore for so long? What other cases had he influenced with bias or ego? Would the justice system truly begin to police its own, or would it close ranks once again? And for Jasmine, what would come next? She had walked through fire and emerged unburned, but the path ahead would only get more treacherous. Her name, once whispered in political circles, was now being shouted in every newsroom. The courtroom may have emptied, but the halls of power were only just beginning to stir. Jasmine Crockett had gone viral, not as a politician, not as a lawyer, but as something more dangerous to the status quo, a disruptor with receipts. Across the country, late-night show hosts cracked jokes about Judge Treymore's dramatic downfall. But inside Washington, no one was laughing. Quiet meetings sprung up in wood-paneled rooms, behind sealed doors and tinted windows. Men in tailored suits and women with tightly clenched briefcases whispered about the implications. One of their own had been taken down, and not by scandalous rumors or partisan leaks, but by cold, undeniable law. What made Jasmine so dangerous? It wasn't just her intellect. It wasn't just her poise. It was the way she used both like a scalpel, not a sword. Precise, methodical, and impossible to dismiss. By the time the weekend came, 3 more complaints against Judge Treymore surfaced, buried deep in judicial archives, and quietly closed without explanation. Now, they were being unearthed one by one. The Department of Justice announced an internal review. A judiciary watchdog panel began issuing subpoenas. And in the eye of the storm, Jasmine Crockett. She returned to Capitol Hill as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Journalists swarmed her for statements. Colleagues pulled her aside for whispered congratulations. And then there were the others, the ones who avoided her gaze, who hurried past her in hallways, afraid of what her presence now represented. She had become a mirror too clear for some to look into. Late one evening, she was called into a closed-door committee session. The chairwoman, a veteran senator with decades of political war stories behind her eyes, didn't offer small talk. "You shook a pillar, Jasmine," she said flatly. "Do you understand the weight of that?" Jasmine didn't blink. "I didn't shake it. I just stopped pretending it wasn't already cracked," the senator sighed. "There are people in this town who don't like being reminded that their robes, titles, and power don't make them untouchable. You've made enemies. Quiet ones. Then let them stay quiet," Jasmine said. "They'll be easier to hear when they try to strike." That night, her office received a package. No return address. Inside was a thick manila envelope. Documents. Hundreds of them. Sealed transcripts, court memos, internal communications, all connected to Judge Treymore and several others still sitting on benches across the country. No note, just a single red tab on the first page. It was a map, not of streets, but of corruption. The next morning, she held a press conference. The usual crowd arrived, some expecting another reactionary statement, others just chasing the headlines. But what they got was something far more deliberate. "This is not about one judge," Jasmine began, standing behind a podium stripped of branding or slogans. "This is about a culture of immunity, a system where those who swore to uphold the law often use it as armor against the very people they serve." She opened the folder and placed several copies on the table beside her. "Today, we begin the process of unsealing these cases. The public deserves to know the truth, not just about Treymore, but about every bench that has been used as a throne instead of a place of justice." The crowd erupted in questions. "Are you accusing other judges? What if this turns into a witch hunt? Do you expect retaliation?" Jasmine looked directly into the cameras. "I expect the truth to be uncomfortable, but discomfort is not injustice. Silence is." Behind her, several members of Congress appeared, surprising ones, members from both parties, former prosecutors, and even a retired federal judge. They didn't speak, but their presence said enough. She was not alone anymore. But the deeper she dug, the more dangerous the ground beneath her became. The documents led to sealed settlements involving political donors, private prison contracts, and even connections to lobbying groups that operated through shadowy intermediaries. And then the threats began. Anonymous messages, warnings left on her voicemail, unmarked vehicles idling outside her home at night. Her staff grew more cautious, her security tighter. Still, she refused to flinch. In a private conversation with her chief of staff, Jasmine said what she had been holding back. "For weeks, this isn't just about judges or justice," she whispered. "It's about whether this country is willing to be honest with itself. And if I have to be the one to pull back the curtain, then so be it." The final domino was about to fall. And when it did, it would shake not just courtrooms, but the entire foundation of power in America. It began with a leak. Not from Jasmine Crockett, not from her staff, not even from someone inside the Department of Justice. It came from a court clerk in a sleepy southern district, tired of watching lives shattered in silence. One of the sealed files Jasmine had referenced during her press conference contained evidence of judicial misconduct so blatant, so grotesquely unpunished, that it defied belief. And now it was public. The story broke just after midnight. A federal judge had allegedly colluded with a private contractor to divert low-income defendants into for-profit detention programs, often for offenses as minor as unpaid parking tickets. One name appeared throughout the documents, over and over: Judge Treymore. He had been the linchpin. The reaction was swift and merciless. By morning, several state attorneys general launched parallel investigations. Protesters marched not just in front of courthouses, but in the streets of cities from coast to coast. "Justice is not for sale" became a rallying cry. Cable news anchors no longer treated Jasmine Crockett as a curiosity or a lightning rod. She had become a symbol, a reminder that truth can still shatter even the most protected walls. But the real battle was still ahead. Congress scheduled a historic oversight hearing, and Jasmine was invited to testify. Not as a politician, not even as a witness, but as a catalyst. The hearing room was packed to the rafters. C-SPAN streamed every second. Millions watched in silence. Jasmine spoke without notes. She told the story not just of Treymore, but of the hidden architecture behind his rise. She spoke of the whistleblowers who had been ignored, the journalists who had been threatened, the citizens who had been robbed of due process, while judges built empires from their misery. "You don't need to be corrupt to benefit from corruption," she said, her voice like steel. "You only need to look away." There were no outbursts, no snide remarks, no staged interruptions. The committee, filled with some of the sharpest and most skeptical minds in Washington, simply listened. When she finished, one of the oldest senators at the table leaned forward and spoke slowly, almost reverently. "I've served in this chamber for over 30 years, he said, "and I have never seen someone walk into this room and change its air." Jasmine nodded, but in her eyes there was no pride, only resolve, because now the movement had outgrown her. Citizen coalitions launched initiatives to audit judicial behavior. Law schools began revising curricula to teach students how to identify and report ethical violations early. A bipartisan group of lawmakers introduced the Crockett Integrity Act, a sweeping piece of legislation designed to establish independent oversight over federal and state judges. Transparency was no longer a pipe dream. It was becoming law. The judge who once mocked her in open court had become a footnote in a much larger transformation. His arrest, once viewed as a shock, was now seen as the first crack in a rotting dam. And Jasmine? She didn't run for glory. She didn't cash in on book deals or media contracts. She returned to her work, a little quieter, a little more guarded, but still razor-sharp. When asked by a reporter weeks later how it felt to be the woman who brought down an empire, she responded with a shrug. "I didn't bring it down," she said. "I just showed people where the foundations were crumbling." One evening, walking alone past the courthouse steps where it had all unfolded, Jasmine paused. A young law student approached her, nervous, clutching a stack of books. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, "I watched the hearings. You changed the reason I went to law school." She smiled, offered a quick handshake, and continued walking. Her legacy wasn't sealed in applause or headlines. It lived in the minds she had sparked and the systems she had dared to confront. In a country too long conditioned to expect silence from its servants, Jasmine Crockett reminded everyone what courage sounds like when spoken clearly, and what justice looks like when it finally answers back.